What if everything we know about money, every paycheck, every loan, every single coin, wasn't born from trade or progress, but from a system of control? What if the world's very first economy wasn't about goods and services at all, but about obedience? 3,000 years before Wall Street, before banks, before the word finance even existed, the richest and most powerful institution on earth wasn't a kingdom or a corporation. It was the temple. The priests weren't just spiritual guides, they were the first central bankers. And they built an invisible system of control so powerful, its blueprint is still shaping how money dictates our lives today. Inflation, debt, taxes, they all trace back to one place: the temples of ancient Sumer and Egypt. In this system, you were essentially born into debt, and your faith was the collateral. Sound far-fetched? Just wait until you see the receipts. Literally, the receipts, buried under the sands of Ur and Thebes. Because hidden within ancient clay tablets and forgotten hymns is a chilling truth. The markets weren't created to serve people. They were designed to bind them. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. We're building a global community of thinkers who want the unfiltered truth, the kind they definitely don't teach you in school. Hit that subscribe button now, because by the end of this video, you'll see exactly how a handful of ancient priests engineered the first great financial illusion, and how their legacy still dictates the price of your freedom today. Let's journey back, way back, to around 3200 BCE, the dawn of written history. We're in ancient Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq. Civilization was just starting to bloom. People were forming cities, organizing massive labor projects, and, crucially, recording transactions. But here's the twist that changes everything. Those first records weren't about poetry, laws, or science. They were overwhelmingly about debts owed to the temples. The world's earliest form of writing, cuneiform, was literally invented to keep track of grain deposits and labor obligations to the gods. Think about that for a second. Humanity's first written words were receipts. The temple acted as a massive, centralized storehouse. Farmers would bring their grain after the harvest, entrusting it to the priests. In theory, the priests would manage this wealth for the community, redistributing it during droughts or for religious festivals. It sounds like a great community service, right? But here's the catch. The temple kept meticulous ledgers, and every single person who deposited food, animals, or goods was now part of a credit system that only the priests could read and interpret. They controlled the scales, they defined the units of measurement, and they set the terms of fair trade. Does that sound a little familiar? When you deposit your money in a modern bank, you're told it's your money, safe and sound. But the moment it's there, the institution lends it out, leverages it, and monetizes it, often in ways you'll never know about. Just like in the ancient temples of Uruk, your deposit becomes their asset, and your dependence on their system grows. Now, let's add another layer. Imagine a world where literacy is a sacred, guarded skill. Only the priests could read and write. They were the only ones who recorded the numbers. If a farmer questioned the record of how much grain he owed, or what his family's debt was, he couldn't even read the clay tablets to argue his case. The temple had a complete monopoly on the truth. That's not a free market. It's engineered dependency. It's a system built on informational asymmetry, where one party holds all the cards. This structure is a recurring theme throughout history. Fast forward to medieval Europe. The church collects tithes, owns vast stretches of land, and issues indulgences, literally paper promises of spiritual credit in exchange for cold, hard cash. Fast forward again to 1913 in the United States. The Federal Reserve Act is passed, effectively transferring the power to create money from the public to a consortium of private banks. Each time, the same fundamental structure repeats itself. A sacred, untouchable authority manages the system of value, supposedly for the sake of stability, but always benefits from the complexity and opacity of that system. These ancient economies weren't simple barter markets where you'd trade 2 chickens for a pot. They were sophisticated, spiritual financial hybrids. People weren't just trading goods. They were trading their loyalty and obedience. The priests declared that serving the temple was the same as serving the gods. To disobey the temple's financial rules wasn't just a civil offense. It was cosmic treason. Now, think about the language we use around money today. "In God we trust" is printed on the US dollar. We talk about having faith in the economy. Entire markets can rise or fall based on a feeling, on consumer confidence. We think we've evolved past ancient superstition, but the core psychological mechanism, the mechanism of belief, that made a Sumerian farmer surrender his harvest is the very same one that drives our modern economic system. We've just swapped clay tablets for digital ledgers and priests for central bankers. And this is where the story gets even darker. What happened when people couldn't pay their debts? When a harvest failed or a family fell on hard times? Did the divine, merciful institution forgive them? Not a chance. Historical tablets discovered in the ancient city of Lagash show that entire families were listed as temple property. A child could be born into a state of generational debt, destined to work for an institution that claimed divine authority over them. Their labor, their future, their very lives were collateral. Now, let's translate that into modern terms. Think about student loans that burden people for decades, intergenerational debt passed down through families, or mortgages that can outlive the people who took them out. The principle is exactly the same. It's just been digitized and dressed up in modern financial language. It's a system where debt isn't just a transaction, but a long-term mechanism of control. So, when we hear economists talk about the invisible hand of the market guiding everything for the best, maybe we should start asking a more pointed question. Whose hand is it, really? Here's the part that historians rarely emphasize and where the real conspiracy begins. Around 2600 BCE, a monumental shift happened. The high priests of Sumer discovered something revolutionary. They realized they could issue clay tokens representing grain that wasn't actually in there. These tokens, stamped with divine symbols, started circulating just like real money. They were a promise, a guarantee of real goods supposedly backed by the temple's vast reserves. But here's the catch. Nobody could ever truly verify those reserves. Does that sound a little familiar? This was the very first instance of fractional reserve banking, thousands of years before the concept had a name. As long as the people believed in the temple's promise, the priests could create credit out of thin air, far beyond what they actually possessed. They literally turned faith into currency. And with that single move, the temple transformed from a simple storehouse into the very source of money itself. The public thought they were trading value. In reality, they were trading beliefs. Fast forward a few thousand years. Goldsmiths in 17th century London are doing the exact same thing, issuing more paper receipts for gold than the actual gold sitting in their vaults. Sound familiar? It's the same principle. And then, central banks adopted it as official policy. The Sumerian priests had discovered the ultimate formula, and the world has been running on it ever since. Because once you control both debt and faith, you control civilization itself. And here's a detail that's been quietly buried in academic archives. Cuneiform records from the Temple of Enlil in Nippur reveal a fascinating practice. During certain festivals, the priests would deliberately cancel debts. But this wasn't charity. It was a strategic move to reset the population's dependence. People would celebrate their newfound freedom, all while the system was quietly preparing to ensnare them again the very next season. Debt forgiveness wasn't an act of mercy, it was system maintenance. You think modern debt jubilees or bank bailouts are new? You think the 2008 financial crisis was some spontaneous event? The playbook is ancient. The methods have been refined, but the core strategy remains unchanged. So how did this ancient system work? And why is it the blueprint for every modern financial regime? Let's break it down step by step. Step 1. Secure a monopoly on knowledge. In Sumer, only the priests could read and write. Cuneiform was a sacred, complex language, not a public tool for communication. They were the ones who decided what each symbol meant. They set the exchange rates, how much barley was worth 1 shekel, how much labor was worth a goat, and what the penalties were for late payments. The entire population depended on the temple to define what value even was. Now, let's translate that to today. Who defines what a dollar is? The Federal Reserve. Who adjusts its supply, its interest rates, its worth relative to goods and services? A modern priest class. They just wear suits instead of robes. Step 2. Convert faith into credit. The core promise of every major temple was simple. If you serve the gods, they will provide for you. The priests used this deep-seated trust to issue grain credits, essentially, IOUs from the gods. These clay receipts began to circulate as a form of currency. Ordinary people accepted them, not because they were backed by grain, but because they believed the gods stood behind that promise. It was a 5,000-year-old IOU system. The modern equivalent? Fiat currency. Paper money backed not by gold or any physical commodity, but by full faith and credit. The key word there is faith. Step 3. Create scarcity, then monetize it. Cuneiform records from around 2350 BCE show that priests would deliberately withhold grain from circulation during certain seasons to drive up its value. They would frame it as divine will. The gods demand more offerings. Meanwhile, as engineered scarcity took hold, the price of grain would skyrocket, sometimes by as much as 300% during a drought. People were forced to sell their land, their belongings, and even their own freedom just to eat. And the temple profited handsomely from the crisis it had orchestrated. Does that remind you of anything? Like when central banks tighten the money supply and markets correct? Or when inflation mysteriously spikes after a global shock? Same play, different costumes. Step 4. Tax the very system you created. Once the temple controlled the distribution of goods, they began taxing every transaction in the name of divine service. Every trade required a small offering, usually around 2 to 5% of the deal, to ensure the god's blessing. By 2100 BCE, some temples were extracting up to 20% of the entire region's agricultural output as a holy duty. That's not devotion. That's organized taxation on a grand scale. Today, we just call it monetary policy. Step 5. Use debt as a tool for population control. When people couldn't pay their debts, the temples took collateral. First, it was land and livestock. Then, it was people. In a single archive discovered at the city of Lagash, archaeologists found over 4,000 debt contracts that legally transferred family members into temple servitude. Think about that for a moment. 4,000 individual lives turned into economic assets on a balance sheet. This wasn't random bad luck. It was a systemic feature. Modern credit scores, wage garnishments, and property repossessions are the legal echoes of those same ancient instruments. The methods have evolved, but the morality of the mechanism hasn't changed much. Step 6. Institutionalize the entire cycle. To prevent the system from collapsing under its own weight, kings would occasionally declare a debt jubilee, wiping the slate clean for everyone. But this was never a revolution for the people. It was a strategic reset for the system. By erasing the records, the rulers kept the population hopeful. See, the gods are merciful, they forgive. And then, the very next season, the cycle of debt would begin all over again. Faith was renewed. Productivity surged. And most importantly, control was maintained. In today's language, we call this the bailout cycle. After the 2008 crash, trillions of dollars were printed to save the system. The banks were forgiven, not the borrowers. The ancient priests would have nodded in silent approval. Now, here's where the system took a quantum leap. Around 1800 BCE, the temples began issuing interest-bearing loans. They justified this by claiming it was divine compensation for the risk they were taking. And the average rate? A staggering 33 1/3% annually. A full third of your yearly harvest went straight to the temple. That's a higher interest rate than most modern credit cards. This is the oldest documented form of usury, and it was cloaked in the language of holiness. And why does that matter so much? Because when you merge morality with money, questioning the financial system becomes a form of heresy. You can't rebel against something that's been framed as divine, absolute truth. That's why this temple bank model endured for millennia. Empires rose and fell, but the invisible infrastructure of finance, controlled currency, managed scarcity, and debt as leverage survived. It was passed down from Sumer to Babylon, from Persia to Rome. Now, this is where it gets a little uncomfortable. Many of the symbols from these ancient temples, the stepped ziggurat, the all-seeing eye, the winged sun disk, keep appearing in the architecture of modern financial institutions and even on our national currencies. This imagery persists for a reason. It reinforces a sense of ancient, unbroken continuity. It projects the idea that some unseen, all-powerful order is watching over the very concept of value. When we talk about the $300 trillion of global debt today, we're not just talking about a number. We are witnessing the mature form of a system that has been perfected over 5,000 years. Every time a government issues a bond, every time a bank creates credit, It's an echo of that same ancient temple mechanism, value created from pure belief and sustained by obedience. And just like the ancient priests, today's financial elite use their own form of ritual language. Quantitative easing, fiscal stabilization, debt instruments. They sound so neutral, so technical. But these aren't just terms, they're designed to mystify, to obscure a simple, brutal truth. Money is a form of power that only works if you don't question it. Let's put that into perspective. Travel back with me to ancient Sumer, around 2500 BCE. The temple complex of Eanna, a religious and economic powerhouse, eventually collapsed. But before it did, the priesthood had managed to accumulate control over roughly 70% of all the farmable land in the region. 70%. Think about that. Ordinary citizens became tenants on their own ancestral soil, bound by debt to the very institutions that promised them salvation. Now, let's fast forward a few thousand years. Rome falls in 476 CE. What happens next? The Christian Church steps into the power vacuum, eventually holding a similar proportion of Europe's land, nearly one-third of the entire continent. This continuity isn't a coincidence. It's an inheritance of a system. From Sumer to Rome and beyond, a clear pattern emerges. Every empire that mastered credit mastered its people. And every time society forgot who was holding the ledger, history repeated itself with a devastating crash, a debt crisis, widespread social unrest, the collapse of the old order, and then a consolidation of power by a new elite. The priests of Sumer weren't just participating in the market, they were the market. They controlled the flow of goods, set the terms of loans, and kept the records. But their greatest invention wasn't the silver shekel or the barley loan. It was belief. They transformed abstract value into an article of faith, a system where their authority was absolute because they were the sole arbiters of that value. And that's the through line that connects their world directly to ours. Today, our temples are skyscrapers made of glass and steel. Our high priests are economists and central bankers, speaking in a complex language of derivatives and quantitative easing. The rituals are still performed daily. The opening bell, the trading floor frenzy, the closing bell, repeat. And just like those ancient worshippers who brought their offerings to the temple, we participate faithfully in this system, day in and day out, without ever getting a glimpse inside the real vault where the power is held. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? If the very first markets weren't built to create widespread prosperity, but to manage obedience and extract wealth, what does that say about the global financial system we live under right now? The fundamental mechanism hasn't changed at all. It's just been digitized and scaled up globally. The same priesthood, the same elite class, now operates through central banks, data monopolies, and the invisible hand of algorithmic control. Instead of grand temples of stone, we have global clearinghouses that process trillions of dollars in transactions every single day, completely out of public view. Instead of religious tithes, we have a whole menu of modern obligations. Income taxes, property taxes, interest on every form of debt, and the silent tax of inflation that steadily erodes the value of our savings. And instead of clay tablets marked with cuneiform, we have massive server farms etched with code, a language just as absolute and unchangeable for the average person. The illusion of freedom is maintained by constant motion, by the feeling that we are getting somewhere. Debt grows, forcing you to work more. Prices rise, making your earnings worth less. Then, when the system strains, bailouts are given to the very institutions that caused the problem, resetting the game board without changing the rules. You find yourself running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Just like those ancient Sumerian farmers, we are bound by unseen ledgers that are fundamentally designed to favor the issuer, the creditor, the one who creates the money out of thin air. The shocking truth is this: we never really left the temple. We just built taller ones and convinced ourselves we were free because we could walk in and out. But our belief is what sustains the whole illusion. The moment we, the collective, stop believing in the paper money, the digital promise, the government policy, the entire fragile structure collapses. And history shows us exactly what happens when that belief finally breaks. Empires fall, currencies become worthless, and the same elite class that benefited from the old system quietly steps in to rebuild the next version, always ensuring they remain at the top. But this time, it's different. The next reset won't take centuries to unfold. It will take seconds. A digital switch flipped, a banking glitch announced on the news, and your wealth, your life savings, becomes just lines of data. Data that is editable, erasable, controllable. Think about it. We've been trained to accept digital currency, to embrace the convenience of a cashless society. But what happens when that convenience becomes a tool of absolute control? What happens when your ability to buy, sell, or even travel can be turned off with a single keystroke? This isn't a far-fetched theory. It's the logical conclusion of the path we are on. The system of control that began with clay tablets is reaching its final, most perfect form. A digital ledger where every transaction is tracked and every individual is tied to a centralized authority. The ultimate temple. So, I urge you, share this video with someone who still believes the system is built for their benefit. Challenge them to ask the hard questions, to look past the daily noise and see the historical patterns. Ask them to question who really holds the ledger of our world. And if you're one of the few who already sees it, who refuses to bow to this engineered faith, then subscribe and join this community. Let's stay awake together, because the world is changing faster than ever. The real question we need to ask ourselves isn't how far we've come from those ancient temples. It's whether we've ever truly left them at all. Are we wiser now? Or are we just walking the same well-worn path, only this time in better suits? Thanks for watching.